Hello, welcome back to Law and Crypto. My name is William Kraus, and I'm an attorney focusing on litigation, governmental investigations, and other disputes related to digital assets and blockchain technology. As always, this is your friendly other weekly reminder that while I am an attorney, I'm not your attorney, so anything I say shouldn't be taken as legal advice regarding your specific situation or investment advice of any sort. I also need to make clear that everything I say is my personal opinion, not necessarily the opinion of my law firm, and my comments are being offered for entertainment and discussion purposes only. This also could be considered attorney advertising in some states. So if you do want to contact me or speak to me about your specific legal issue, feel free to reach out via the website for my firm or on my Twitter handle, WKrausESQ. And with that out of the way, let's start our discussion. So if you've been paying attention to crypto at all, I'm sure you have, I'm going to assume you're familiar with the collapse of Terra USD, which I'll refer to here as UST. In short, UST was roughly an $18 billion algorithmic stablecoin. And while it was supposed to maintain a value close to $1, of course, it fell to 35 cents. And now I think today it's like at 6 or 7 cents, with the asset Luna, which is supposed to help stabilize UST's price, likewise collapsing from like $80 to a few cents. As the dust settled, it came out that the Luna Foundation Guard sold off more than 79,000 Bitcoin from its reserves in an attempt to save the peg. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to get into sort of the secondary market effects of that, but not surprisingly, there are stories of investors losing huge amounts of money, and the governments of the world, as well as private litigants, have not surprisingly taken notice. So let's talk about the law and the regulation side of things, and really what I think the fallout from UST is going to be. Now, in the United States, the collapse of UST really couldn't have come at a worse time for stablecoin regulation. As I've been saying for a few months, there's currently a ton of political pressure to bring increased regulation to the stablecoin market, coming from pretty much every direction. What the stablecoin and the issuers of the world did not need right now was the utter implosion, utter public implosion of one of the larger assets in the space. So let me get my thesis out right now. And others like CoinDesk have pointed this out. I think we're going to look back on the collapse of the UST as sort of the moment when the regulation of stablecoins and regulation of algorithmic stables in particular got serious. So what do I mean? Well, if you've been listening to these shows, you know that there's been plenty of governmental rumblings about what to do about traditional stables. Now, I mentioned a few weeks ago that the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency had signaled that it wanted oversight over stablecoins, with Acting Commissioner Hugh calling for a fixed set of safety and soundness requirements, and noting that, in my experience, the wider the variability, the more likely a risky issuer blows itself up, sparking contagion across peers. At the same time, we have the SEC circling around stablecoins, seemingly in an effort to kind of stake out their jurisdiction. And we've had a slew of proposed legislation coming out of DC. All told, Forbes reported that this current session of Congress has seen something like 50 bills, I think, and resolutions, not even counting the draft resolutions, that touch on crypto in some way. That is absolutely crazy. I mean, the regulation and the law surrounding crypto is just exploding right now. And like I mentioned before, a lot of that legislation is touching on stables in some way. In April, we had the Stablecoin Trust Act, which set forth a couple of paths for stablecoin issuers to get licensed, whether it be the OCC, state level money transmission requirements, or a traditional bank charter. And a few weeks before that, Senator Bill Hagerty introduced the Stablecoin Transparency Act. And on top of that, Senator Cynthia Lummis, has been teasing the introduction of sort of a crypto-wide legislative framework that's going to touch on crypto as well, or touch on stables as well, sorry. And there were a few others that I'm not mentioning as well. So this is where we're at in April and early May before this all happened. And now you have this arguably predictable collapse of a major algorithmic stable, and the pressure has just gone to 11. So that said, there are a few interesting sub-themes I think this is going to bring about. First, a lot of the discussion around stables has been premised on this notion that they need regulation because they are, too big to fail. And I mentioned the OCC speech. The acting comptroller claimed that the relationship between stables and the larger market can be depicted as an upside down pyramid, with $2 trillion worth of crypto resting on roughly $180 billion of stablecoin there at the bottom. In other words, he's saying that to protect all crypto investors, we need to regulate stables, which are at the base of that upside down pyramid. But you just had a major collapse in the market. And while the market did take a hit, it just survived. So the question we're all asking is, do we really need to regulate stables because they can take down the entire market? And to that end, I'll put up my first slide here. To that end, we have Patrick Toomey, Senator Toomey, asking some questions about this, right? He was the author of the Stablecoin Trust Act, which I mentioned, and here he went full free market, and seemed to say that the UST collapse showed that it didn't really present a systemic risk. I think it's right here. If there's no systemic risk, then it should be up to consumers. What we want is for consumers to know what they're doing, what risks they're taking, and the markets can figure out what the good investments and what are bad investments. Honestly, it will probably take some failures in this space in order for the market to discover what works. And that's really sort of an interesting position. I mean, seemingly because with UST, you're seeing politicians like Patrick Toomey here start to understand that there's a difference between algo stables and reserve-backed stables, like Tether, which, by the way, notwithstanding all the flack around it, observed billions of dollars of redemption smoothly as the market had a huge sell-off. So, on the one hand, while you have algorithmic stables having this very public collapse, you have sort of the biggest, target in the traditional stables doing just fine. And I think that's going to sort of shape the discussion as well. Now, does that mean that traditional stables are off the hook for regulation, or that we're going to see regulation sort of just for algo stables? It's not that clear. On the one hand, some people like Toomey are saying that we need to focus more on regulation of traditional stables because they actually are too big to fail and more likely to be used as a substitute for cash in transactions. That line of thinking seemingly takes the position that algo stables should be allowed to flare up and die off because they're not significant enough of the market to really matter. On the other hand, you obviously have the risk of algo stables front and center now. And everybody in DC seemingly talking and asking each other what these things are and what do we do about it. And that gets me to the next slide. So here, unlike Republicans, we recognize that there's a real risk to stablecoin cryptos, the Senate Banking Committee chairman. And in fact, on the other side of the aisle, Senator Toomey is a Republican. Here you have Democrats in the US increasingly asserting that this sort of free market approach doesn't adequately assess what they perceive to be the risk associated with stablecoins. I'm not going to call balls and strikes here, but in my opinion, at least judging from the sound bites that are coming out in the wake of the UST collapse, the Republicans at least seem to have the advantage in terms of how they understand the market and the underlying digital assets. They're actually differentiating between different products and saying this approach might be we might need a different approach for one type of product as opposed to this other kind of product, even though they're all globally stable coins. And they're not pushing what I see to be a sort of one size fits all, crypto is dangerous and we need to regulate an approach. I think that's the wrong approach here. So in that way, this might be what I refer to as sort of a Libra moment for stablecoins. And, I've seen that written somewhere else. Do you guys, I assume you remember Libra, right? I mean, as a brief history, Libra was Facebook's coin, first Libra, later DM. And really that kind of started what we saw as the sort of, legislative firestorm, right? And if you recall, Facebook came out and said, we've got this idea for this stable coin. We're going to push it out to all of our users on Facebook, or a lot of our users on Facebook. And honestly, in that moment in time, DC freaked out, right? Because for the first time, you had this sort of social media body with billions of users, seemingly about to push out this digital asset that could supplant the US dollar, at least when you're talking about the billions of people who use Facebook. And, there was all those congressional hearings, Mark Zuckerberg, testifying before Congress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Libra and then later DM, its sort of rebrand, ended up fading away in response to, as the Washington Post says, regulatory pushback. I don't know about the internal conflict part of it. You can read about that, but a lot of, congressional attention on that. We might have the same moment right now for stablecoins, right? You might have a moment in which everybody sort of looks around and says, wow, look at what just happened. And that sort of acts as a catalyst to unlock sort of, the stalemate that there's been right now in terms of crypto legislation, as, Democrats and Republicans basically been unwilling to work together in any meaningful way to push forward crypto legislation. Excuse me. Third and most finally, I think, what we're likely going to see is even more pressure to sort of, take the Democrat approach. I think you're going to see a lot of nations, and maybe in the US, sort of say, Here, we're proposing crypto framework that's going to touch all crypto, regardless of differentiation between them. And G7 actually seems to be going that way. Just over the last week, I saw this comment that the G7, is calling for the swift development and implementation of consistent and comprehensive regulation regarding the entire market, in response to what happened with UST. So I think where the political will is there, or the political agenda is sort of anti-crypto, you're going to hear UST a lot. I mean, it was just bad for everybody, and for the entire market in terms of regulation. And, I think the real thing for me, at least, is going to be what the US ends up doing. As requested by President Biden's executive order on digital assets, Department of Treasury was due to provide their financial stability risk and regulatory gap report, on or around October 5th. And you can bet that UST is going to be featured prominently in that. The question is going to be, will it be against the backdrop of regulating parts of the market or all of it? And, I think you're going to take it in a different direction. Blockworks actually pointed this out. There's an interesting new discussion as to whether the UST collapse is going to lead to a stronger push for CBDCs in the United States, central bank digital currencies. Here, the Biden EO touched on CBDCs and called for studies and reports and things like that, talking about the potential use cases for those assets and how we roll that out. And you have some folks saying, look at what happened with UST. The CBDC is a better way of protecting people who want to transact in crypto and using it as an alternative to traditional finance. Now, again, like everything, on the other hand, you have the opposite. Particularly, you have Republican members of the U.S. House Committee on Financial Services sending a letter last week to Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell advocating for stablecoins over CBDCs as the potential cornerstone of a modern payment system, with the sort of concerns around CBDCs being fairly summarized as, privacy and, a lot of things that I think people are worried about with that. So for what it's worth, I think we're also a long ways off from having a US CBDC that could even conceptually challenge the role stablecoins play in the market right now, but it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But all told, I think, at least from a regulatory perspective, the USDT collapse is absolutely going to ratchet up the pressure to impose regulation on stablecoins. And there already was a lot of pressure. What regulations we actually get and when is really the big question. So that's the regulatory side of things. What about the rest of the law? Well, I think the UST fallout there is just getting started. First, I think you're going to see governmental investigations left and right. It's already been reported that the South Koreans and the sort of specialized financial unit they have in their government is investigating. And there's also seemingly, some sort of tax reporting, compliance type of thing going on in South Korea as well. And in the US, let's not forget that the SEC is already on the scene, as they were said to be investigating the MIR protocol, which allowed, sort of mirrored versions of US stocks to be traded for UST. Now, if you recall, the SEC served Duquan in September of last year, before he was about to go on stage and speak at some conference in New York. There was a bunch of sort of, back and forth about that. The Terraform Labs and Duquan challenged service in the Southern District of New York and ultimately lost, seemingly allowing the SEC to move forward with its investigation in response to the subpoena they issued. Now, given that you likely already have the SEC months into an investigation regarding the company and its leadership, I'd be absolutely shocked if there were not subpoenas going out last week, this week, whenever, regarding what happened and trying to sort of, expand the scope of that investigation. And to that end, you should see a new slide here. Terraform Labs legal team resigns after UST collapse. It's been reported, like I said, that in-house legal leadership has largely left the building. You've got resignation seemingly of general counsel, chief corporate counsel, and chief litigation and regulatory counsel. Suffice to say, that sort of thing, at least when it has happened in the past with other companies, is a very bad look. I'm not saying it's a bad look with regard to Terraform, but the optics of in-house legal sort of moving out and up, or up and out rather, mass exodus, that is problematic. I mean, at least when you're looking at traditional companies, that can signal that there is some sort of managerial decision taking place that legal does not agree with, or, in the worst case scenario, legal feels that they might be on the hook for something. But in any event, when legal leaves the room, regulators notice, and that's a problem. Again, I'm not saying that's happening with Terraforms, but just generally. And when there's blood in the water, you can bet that lawsuits aren't far behind either. It's been reported that within a week or so of the collapse, a South Korean firm had sued Do Kwon and co-founder Daniel Shin on behalf of investors. South Korea making sense for jurisdictional purposes, given that Do Kwon is a South Korean national. And in my opinion, it's only a matter of time before you see one or more class actions in the United States. I guarantee somebody is writing a class action complaint somewhere in the United States right now. And I can see that making any variety of claims, maybe something based on representations made about UST versus what happened, maybe something based on consumer protection laws. Time will really tell. And at that time, I expect Do Kwon or Terraform Labs or whoever to say they're not subject to US jurisdiction. And I just pulled up, a filing there from TFL in the Southern District of New York when they were challenging the SEC subpoena. I think you're going to see the exact same arguments if you want to preview here raised in whatever motion dismiss follows the class action. That's just my sort of crystal ball prediction here. But they're going to be up against a little bit of a wall here. I mean, the Southern District of New York, in ruling on their opposition before, sort of rejected these arguments and essentially found by default that Terraform Labs and Do Kwon are subject to the SEC's jurisdiction, which conceivably should say that they're not sort of an extraterritorial organization in the same way that Binance was when they had their case or their class action dismissed about a month or so ago. In any event, I look forward to discussing it with you guys when it comes to pass. And that's what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed our discussion, and I will talk to you again soon.